these are challenging economic times. In times like this, culture could go out the window. How do you make sure that you are contributing to maintaining an ethical culture in these changing economic times? And what is your role as a board member in contributing to that culture?
Culture is, the best internal control you can have. I mean, there's no question about that. But the problem is organizations are full of people and, things often go wrong between these people. I think the role of the board is to help the company fill in the gaps. And, I think we can all wax poetic for a long time about the tone at the top. The tone at the top is, I'm not going to say it's easy to get right, but it's easier to get right than the tone in the middle. And the tone in the middle is where things come together and fall apart. And as a board member, I would say that's where we spend a lot of our time, is talking about the tone in the middle. So if you think about the data points that we just talked about, you have employee surveys, you have the score, and you have the participation, which is probably just as important. I'm very spooked when I see a low participation score on an employee survey. That's very weird. We have training completion, yes, but then we also have number of incidents reported. And that's also very interesting. How is that trending? And putting the lens on those and saying what's going on behind that, that tells us about what this tone in the middle is doing. And then the final piece is, how are we addressing tone in the middle? There's been huge turnover the last couple of years, and our companies are now full of Gen Z employees who have a very interesting perspective. And I think the recent research, their perspective went something like this: I know what misconduct looks like. Yes, I'm absolutely willing to report it, except they don't. And when they're asked why they didn't, they say two things. They say, number one, not convinced anything's going to be done. And so that's based on, natural skepticism and observation. And number two, I'm afraid of retaliation. And I'm sorry, but when you open your news feed every morning and it goes layoff, 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 that retaliation risk gets much greater. So I think as a board this year, I would be laser focused on how do we make sure that we're absolutely training managers and we're evaluating and potentially compensating, if we can, leadership on the kinds of data that are telling us whether incidents are being raised and whether that tone in the middle is at the right.
And I actually look at ESG as a value creation driver. And when I work with companies, when I'm on a board and we're trying to find hit of ESG, hit of risk, I want to hear from the people that we're interviewing that they think of this as value creation, as a place where we're going to, drive top line growth, that we're going to, minimize costs, things like that, doing, the policies, procedures across for ESG, implementing those items, which is extremely, important. A lot of people think of ESG as a drain. They think, oh, this reporting, all these other things that we have to do, but it's not. I mean, it could really actually grow the top line of your company if you actually do ESG the right way.
Sure. I would maybe take it a step further. I think ESG has to be integrated not only in your risk framework, but in the strategy of your company, right? So it has to be, it can't be something on the side because it never gets the attention or the traction. It has to be part of how you think about the value you deliver to your stakeholders. And so when we look at strategy for a company, we're really looking at, okay, what's your aspiration, your purpose, and how are you really living that? And I think it's really important because you have to understand the view of all your stakeholders. And your stakeholders are not just investors, right? It's your customers, it's your partners, it's your employees, it's the communities in which you operate. So really understanding what are the expectations, understanding what are your superpowers in this space, because every company does have unique superpowers that they can bring to the conversation. And then figuring out how do you operationalize those things into your plan.
Linda, I'm going to turn to you now. So we've talked a lot about ESG, and I think it was Vina who mentioned that there's lots of stakeholders in play. There's also stakeholders that might not agree, right, on what the trajectory of the company should be taking, the appropriate level of focus on ESG. I wonder, how do you balance those competing interests, right? The demand for greater disclosure, either from regulators or other investor groups, and that pushback that comes from the other side.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the pushback get too much attention within companies, which is a very good thing, because I think it's based on some very, headline-grabbing premises around, whitewashing and woke capitalism and all these things, but it's really not reflecting the reality, I think, in anybody's boardroom. I think the notion that it's one or the other is ridiculous. And I think the notion that anybody thinks we should move back from, a stakeholder governance model to a short-term shareholder profit model, I don't think anybody really thinks that. So that being said, I think one of the rules of the board is to defend the credibility of ESG, and I think that's incredibly important. So I think we're going to see companies evolve to more holistic messaging, and I think that makes sense to everybody.
I wanted to know how your companies and your boards have evolved in their approach to cybersecurity risk, and how you're thinking about it now versus how you guys were thinking about it maybe 10 years ago.
So it's continually evolving, and as Vina said, it's how we are being intellectually curious around asking the questions around the whole space. So you have the cybersecurity risks, which have been around a long time, and you continue to have appropriate metrics, around how you're handling your multi-factor authentication, how you're handling, your vulnerability assessments, things like that. So there are set metrics that are in place that people are looking there, but the big one that's actually coming out of that now is data privacy. And so we have, for years, we understood data security and how to protect the data of the company, but now data privacy is bringing it back to you and I, where protecting us, and giving us rights on how we want our data actually used, which is actually, trying to figure out at the board level, the appropriate questions to ask around that and the type of metrics and things that we want around that. And at the board level, we're asking more questions. We're digging in with the CISOs and asking, trying to get the metrics right there. We are dealing with the compliance and legal more. A lot of firms, they do have ethic officers that actually come in and kind of speak to these data privacy issues that are happening across the company. And so those types of things are actually growing out of the cyberspace right now.
I think that's another point I would add is just, it's incumbent upon board members to educate themselves. And, just because when you're a board member, part of why you're asked to be a board member is some of the expertise you might bring, but it's a continuous learning journey as well. So us, raising our own skills as well, as in addition to the specialty, because there's going to be so many additional risks. We were just talking about generative AI.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? And we were talking about, if you saw the news this morning, so, the weekend and Drake just dropped a track, except they didn't.
Right.
It was done by generative AI. So when you think about that coming into companies and what the impact could be, that's going to be a huge risk we were talking about, that you're going to have need expertise on what the possibilities are, right, in the boardroom as well as on the executive team.
Yeah, like Vina and Linda and I were speaking, we're like, this conference is going to be huge ongoing because of things like generative AI. It's changing the industry.